Good evening. Welcome to the Kessler. And we're so happy that you could have joined us for this special evening here on Father's Day. And I'd like to salute all the fathers who are here and ask you to keep a thought in mind for a couple of fathers who aren't here. Drew Phelps, the great bass player who was supposed to be here tonight, unfortunately lost his wife Esther on Thursday. And Jeff Lyles' dad, Alan, went in hospice today. So please keep a thought for both of those, as well as all our other friends who aren't here. And my name is Ken Shimamoto. I'm here tonight, as all of you are, to celebrate and remember the life and music of my friend Dennis Gonzalez. A modern-day Renaissance man, musician, visual artist, poet, educator, father, husband, man. And I've lived in Fort Worth for about 45 years now, but before that, I used to live about 2 blocks from where I'm standing right now in the 400 block of North Winnetka. And when my wife Kat and I came here in 2009 for the groundbreaking of the Kessler, we took a walk over there, and there were still 2 guys sitting on the porch drinking beer, so it didn't seem to me as though a lot of stuff had changed. In fact, there are still businesses in this neighborhood that were there 45 years ago. Chango Botanica is still there. You can go buy a candle. You can go to Norma's and get a chicken fried. You can go to the Jack in the Box, where I saw little boys from the neighborhood holding the guy who was taking the trash at bay, throwing rocks and bottles at him while I waited for my bag of food at 1 o'clock in the morning. And Oak Cliff has changed, like everywhere has changed since then, but I find here in Oak Cliff there is still a lot of the essential character of the neighborhood that I remember from when I used to live here all those years ago. And when Stefan first pulled my coat to see if I'd be willing to introduce this event, first of all I said, of course, I would do anything for Dennis and I would do anything for your family. But Jeff Lyles and I were talking about the deep connection that Dennis had with Oak Cliff, because that first summer I lived in Texas, summer of '78, was the first time I met Dennis. A guitarist friend of mine had a restaurant gig and I was his ride. So we were going to the spot and he said, wait, we gotta stop over on Clinton Avenue and pick up this bass player. This bass player was Dennis. I didn't even know he played trumpet then, although I found out pretty fast. But at that time, Dennis and Carol had not been in the house for very long, just a couple of years. They were starting their careers, respectively, in nursing and education, but already their home had the feel of a creative's lair. There were musical instruments and art objects everywhere, and that only grew as time went on. But thinking about Dennis and Oak Cliff, the phrase pillar of the community seems a little staid for someone as spiritual, mystical, humorous, and yes, playful as Dennis was. I like to think of my friend Dennis as a big tree with deep roots and lots of branches, because although he loved to travel the world and share his creative process with like-minded people all over, he did that from a strong base here in Oak Cliff. Dennis and Carol raised their children, Aaron and Stefan, and they nurtured their creativity in the same way that Dennis did for lots of young musicians and artists over the years. Dennis taught in the Dallas public schools for 40 years, and then after he retired, teaching was just in his blood, and so he founded a nonprofit organization, La Rondalla, which provided free music lessons to young people from the community. Some of them actually had the experience of performing in public on this stage here at the Kessler. And of course, Aaron and Stefan grew up in a hothouse environment surrounded by creative people, musicians from out of town coming in and rehearsing and making records. And before too long, they also took up playing music. They honed their chops playing punk and metal. And I know a lot of 40-something punk rockers in Fort Worth who used to come over here to hear Aaron and Stefan's early band. Some of these people didn't even realize that Dennis was a musician. They just thought he was a cool dad. But by the time I met him, he had already started making his mark. In March '78, he founded DOGNM, the Dallas Association for Avant-Garde and Neo-Impressionistic Music. That's quite a mouthful. And it was a performance collective that didn't last very long, but a record label that continued releasing music into the 21st century. And Dennis showed by example throughout his life that if you take the time and expend the energy to learn how to do the legwork of booking a tour, running a record label, doing the often odious tasks of promotion and marketing, which a lot of creative people shy away from, the payoff for all that effort is you can make music on your own terms throughout your life. And Dennis did that. And DOGNM was his calling card when he started to frequent Caravan of Dreams. I was talking to a friend of mine from Fort Worth just a minute ago about Caravan, the long departed but much loved music venue in downtown Fort Worth, which from the 80s until the late 90s used to present the cream of the day's creative music. Ornette Coleman and his Harmolodic cohort, veterans of the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians from Chicago, artists from the esteemed ECM Records stable. Those were all musicians and styles and forms that Dennis dug. He responded to them, and he in turn got to play with those musicians, got to meet them, was encouraged by people like Anthony Braxton and Art Landee to take his music to the world beyond North Texas. And it seems hard to believe in 2023 that a European record label would send an obscure trumpet player from Dallas a check for $30,000 and say, hey, make some records. But Dennis had proven that he could do it with DOGNM, and Keith Knox, who was the head of Silkhart Records in Sweden, did exactly that. And Dennis cut a series of albums for Silkhart with great musicians from all over. The multi-reedist Charles Burkeen was one, the drummer Alvin Fielder, who became a lifelong friend of Dennis's, and a multitude of other musicians. I love those records because Dennis gets to work with a larger ensemble. You get to hear some of his multi-horn polyphony in the writing. You're going to hear some of that on this stage tonight too. I wept when I was listening to just the tail end of the sound check today, because Chris Curiel, who has the unenviable task of filling the trumpet chair today, worked really hard on the arrangements, and you're really going to be amazed at what you hear. But Dennis made records for Silkhart, for Clean Feed from Portugal, for Ayler from France, and a bunch of other labels. But besides that, besides composing and performing and recording his own music, he also helped to spread awareness and appreciation for creative music throughout North Texas as a broadcaster. On KERA-FM, his show Miles Out ran for 21 years. It got bounced around a lot in the schedule, but it was always there. In '92, when I got out of the military, I had an overnight job in Fort Worth, and Dennis's shows were like a lifeline to me, as they were for a lot of other people. And by the '90s, the late '90s, the responsibilities of raising a family and teaching caused Dennis to put his musical career on the back burner. But Aaron and Stefan were developing as musicians all that time, and in 1999, they made him an offer that he couldn't refuse. They said, "Dad, we want to play free jazz with you." And so Yells at Eels was born. Now, Dennis did not think of his music as something esoteric that only the cognoscenti could comprehend. So Yells at Eels took their sound to all kinds of venues, not just concert halls and clubs. I mean, jazz rooms, rock clubs, DIY punk spaces, museums, art galleries, community centers, libraries. Wherever there were people, they would go play. Some of my favorite video of Yells at Eels, which you can see online in the usual places, was a series of guerrilla performances they did on the streets of Dallas. Now, yeah, you know, I was fortunate because I got to watch Aaron and Stefan grow up in music. I first saw Yells at Eels at the Rec Room in Fort Worth, another much beloved room that doesn't exist anymore. There's a lot of that going around, if you haven't noticed. But every time I saw the band play, I was more amazed at what Dennis's children were up to, how much they had progressed, how much more expressive. Aaron's bass always, digging deep and being very expressive. Stefan's drumming was thunderous and propulsive, and he mastered tune percussion as well, which you're going to get to hear a little later tonight. But I mentioned that to Dennis once, and he just looked at me and smiled, and he said, "They kick my ass." And Dennis actually confided in me once, I don't think he would mind me telling you this now, as his hearing started to deteriorate, which it was for most of the time that he and I were close. Sometimes he couldn't hear on stage, so he told Stefan, "Hit the one hard so I can hear it." And that explains some things that I heard on stage that I didn't realize had that significance until later on. But there came a time, because Aaron and Stefan were also very busy musicians. They performed together and separately in a lot of different contexts. And there came a time that Dennis had a gig book that they couldn't make. So he thought to himself, I need another ensemble, and thus Ataraxia. And Dennis was looking to do something quieter and less intense than he had been doing with Yells at Eels. What he was going for, he told me, was Cadona with John Hassel, trumpet. And Cadona was a trio with trumpet, tabla, and bass. And he had actually talked to Colin Walcott, who was one of the musicians in Cadona, about collaborating at one point. Unfortunately, Colin was killed in a car accident before that could happen. But Dennis had that idea in mind, that he was able to realize it with Drew Phelps, who's not here tonight, and Jagath Priya. And it's hard for me to believe. My wife asked me this afternoon, how long has Dennis been gone? And it's been 15 months. And that's kind of a hard thing for me to accept. I'll admit, I'm a little angry at him for leaving the party so early. I was looking forward to being old men with him for a while, but you don't always get to pick and choose. But the thing about that is, when we leave, we still live in the memories of the people who knew and loved us. And for a musician, as long as your music is still played you're still here in a way. And the kind of tribute that we're going to pay to Dennis tonight is all the more meaningful when it is rendered by musicians who have the living memory of performing with him, who remember learning the material with him and listening and responding to each other on stage. So when you listen to the musicians playing, listen for Dennis too, because he's going to be here. You know, they have quite a fiery galaxy of talent going to be on this stage tonight, besides Aaron, Stefan, who I'm so pleased, it gladdens my heart that they are committed to keeping their father's musical legacy alive. On stage with them, you're going to see on tenor sax, Jason Jackson. He is a musician from Houston. He's an educator like Dennis. He's the education coordinator for Nameless Sound, a nonprofit in Houston. He also plays in the Young Mothers with Stefan. And I still have the memory of hearing him at the Firehouse Gallery in Fort Worth, which also doesn't exist anymore, playing with Dave Dove and thinking, this young guy has that Ben Webster thing that Archie Shepp has, and being very impressed with that. On trombone tonight, you're going to hear Geika James. Both he and Jason have played with Yells at Eels, so they're not strangers to this material. Geika has his own quartet as well as many other projects, but I love his quartet because they're the only band in Dallas that's going to give you what he calls space jazz, as well as funk, New Orleans R&B, and Afrobeat. As Dennis's sometime collaborator Oliver Lake once wrote, "What kind of music you like? Good kind. Put all of my food on the same plate." That's Geika James. And again, Chris Coriel, who plays all kinds of gigs around Fort Worth, was instrumental in putting together the arrangements of Dennis's music you're going to hear tonight. And yeah, I can't say any more about that, but he's got the tough job tonight because he's the man behind the trumpet. There are some other guest stars who you're going to hear. Gerard Bendix, the great drummer, who's played with Chris and Swerve, also was in Tidbits, and he was on some of the earliest Dognim records. He composed a tune for Dennis called the Sonny Murray Cecil Taylor Dancing Lesson, which I hope they will revive in some future incarnation of the Legacy Band. Drew Phelps, of course, can't be here tonight. Greg Prickett, my favorite guitar player in North Texas, who played in Unconscious Collective with Aaron and Stefan, taught at La Rondalla, and his band, the Monks of Saturnalia, is the Dallas band I wish would play more. He was also the last guitar player to play with the great drummer-composer Ronald Shannon Jackson, again, right here on this stage at the Kessler. And last but certainly not least, Lily Taylor, the great vocalist. She's got an album coming out soon. First time I heard Lily was at a house show at Chateau Varego, which is still there, I believe. And she also sang at Dennis's funeral. But that's the band you're gonna hear tonight. I'll tell you one more story. I have to be careful not to repeat myself, because you know, old people tell the same stories over and over again. But back in 2017, Jeff Lyles and I took Dennis to hear King Crimson in Fair Park. And it was a wish fulfillment show. And afterwards, on the sidewalk, waiting for Lyles to bring the car around to pick us up, basically the sidewalk turned into a living Facebook comment section, and everyone was on about, well, this one wasn't as good as that one, and that one could have been better. And Dennis laid down the law. He said, look, why are you comparing this to something old that doesn't exist anymore? Enjoy what they're giving you now. So I ask all of you tonight to join me as we listen, enjoy, and remember Dennis Gonzalez. Thank you.